I want to jump into another topic on this topic, which is gluten can cause major problems with malnutrition. So one of the things that gluten does, right, is it damages the GI tract, leading to malabsorption, so leading to a reduction of vitamins and mineral absorption, so malnutrition in a sense, right? One of the other things that gluten can do is it creates chronic inflammation. Anytime your body's chronically inflamed, one of the things it's going to need more of, one of the things it's going to use more of is nutrients. So chronic inflammation causes loss of nutrition, because what's happening is your body's trying to put out the fire. Your body is trying to put out the inflammation, right? It's trying to reduce it. And what does your body use to reduce inflammation? It uses nutrients. Nutrients are what we use to modulate and control inflammation. And so when you're chronically inflamed, your body's burning through more of your nutrients, okay, in an effort to try to keep your body let's say as protected as possible. But if this goes on indefinitely, if this inflammation becomes multi-year chronic inflammation, then this loss of nutrition is compounded over many years, and we end up more and more nutritionally deprived. Well, many nutrients, when they're low, many nutrient deficiencies actually cause neurological damage and neurological disease. So it's important. Let's just make a little bit of room here. So if we look at just what I've got here on the board, this is a short list. We could talk for months about each one of these nutrients and what they can cause and what they can do. But as an example, B12 helps to produce myelin. Myelin is the insulator, right? If your nerve, as your nerve, so I don't know how many of you took biology in school, but nerves kind of look like this, right? And so along the body of the nerve, you have these big bubbles of fat, and they serve as insulators for that nerve. So if this is the cell body of the nerve, and the nerve is transmitting electricity down the nerve, these nodes or tips, these are called myelin. And what happens when we are B12 deficient is we get areas where the myelin won't grow, won't build. So imagine this area here, there's no insulation, and so the nerve fizzles out. The message doesn't make it where it's supposed to go. It doesn't get to communicate to that next nerve. So that demyelinization, this is where we'll see diseases like multiple sclerosis kick in, and this is why people with MS develop neurological symptoms, sensory neurological symptoms, but also they lose their ability to use their limbs and legs, so they develop down the nerves, they develop loss of nerve function to the muscle, and that leads to muscle atrophy. And again, it can put them in wheelchairs, it can make them non-functional. So B12 is very, very important because it plays a role in myelin production. Now, B12 also plays a role in the regulation of a chemical called homocysteine. Homocysteine is a nerve toxin, so when homocysteine levels are elevated, we know that homocysteine can cause apoptosis of nerve cells. It can cause the death of nerve cells, and we see the same thing with folate. So folate actually plays a role in that as well. Folate regulates homocysteine, B12 regulates homocysteine, so too does vitamin B6. So these three B vitamins kind of work in tandem with each other to control homocysteine, a known nerve toxin that can cause, again, the damage and the destruction of nerve cells. So these are very, very important. Now, that's not all. Folate is also important for the development, so neurological development. So in babies, if you've ever heard of a neural tube defect, this is one of the reasons why most OB-GYNs and doctors will recommend that you take a good multivitamin during pregnancy that has folate in it, right? It's because folate prevents neural tube defects, and which is one of the most common birth defects. It's a neurological birth defect in children, and so folate's very important for that as well. But in adults, folate, again, plays this role here. Vitamin B6 plays a role in multiple chemical reactions that help with neurotransmitters. So your neurotransmitters, for example, dopamine, primary neurotransmitter in the brain, serotonin, primary neurotransmitter in the brain. Guess what? You can't make dopamine and serotonin without vitamin B6. It just won't happen. You can't make serotonin without folate. It just can't happen. So if you are, if you are gluten sensitive and you've been eating gluten the majority of your adult life, and that gluten has damaged you to the level where these nutrients are now depleted, you're going to have a harder time making dopamine. What is dopamine? It's sometimes referred to as a happy neurotransmitter, a happy hormone, but technically it's a neurotransmitter. Serotonin, also sometimes referred to as a mood stabilizing neurotransmitter. Dopamine also helps regulate motor control or muscle control. This is why people with Parkinson's disease, their dopamine areas of their brain are destroyed, and they get tremors, right? They get what's called intentional tremors. They start having abnormal gaits because they don't have adequate dopamine to control their motor coordination. So very, very important chemicals for the nervous system. But you also need vitamin B6 to produce adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are primary neurochemicals involved in the sympathetic nervous system reactivity and function. Now B1, very important for the nervous system. Why do we need B1? Let's make some room here. B1 plays a role in the production. We can't make acetylcholine. Now, many of you struggle with what's referred to as sympathetic dominance. Sympathetic dominance is when you've been inflamed for years and you've been under stress for years. Your sympathetic nervous system is highly activated and highly turned up and ramped up. And the sympathetic nervous system is the opposite of digestion, right? So when your sympathetic tone is too great, you won't digest well, you won't sleep well, you won't heal well. Well, vitamin B1 helps with this. How? It produces acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter that runs the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is the nervous system that helps you sleep, heal, repair, right? Rest. And if you don't have adequate B1, this part of your nervous system won't work appropriately, it won't work properly, and so if you're already in a sympathetic dominance, you get stuck there, and this is where B1 can play a major role. Now, if you've ever heard of the disease beriberi, it's also sometimes the disease state associated with vitamin B1 deficiency, but beriberi affects the nervous system. There's actually a form of beriberi called dry beriberi, which predominantly affects your brain and your nerves, and vitamin B1 deficiency can lead to abnormal thoughts, abnormal behaviors. It can also lead to neuropathy, muscle weakness, and a number of other neurological symptoms. So B1 is very, very important, and it's pretty commonly deficient in people with gluten issues. And all this in this list that I've got on the board for you here, this is probably number one in terms of what we see with gluten sensitivity. Again, that's just this list here. And then B3, vitamin B3 can cause an inflammation that can affect the mind. And as a matter of fact, late stage vitamin B3 deficiency is called pellagra. And this can literally, I'm going to use a non-medical term for you folks, it can make you crazy, right? Pellagra actually causes a schizophrenic-like tendency in the mind. So if your B3 deficiency is severe enough and you've started to develop early stage pellagra, it can literally make your mind not be able to properly think. It can make you go crazy. So very, very important that you understand these B vitamin deficiencies are very, very common in people with gluten issues because of the malabsorption that can happen, but also because of the gluten-induced inflammation that can occur. Then we've got vitamins like vitamin E. Vitamin E is a very potent antioxidant, and one of the things that it does is it helps to protect the myelin. So where this vitamin E is important is it protects that myelin, which is made out of fat, this myelin is. And vitamin E is what we like to call in chemistry the great fat protector. It helps to preserve the fatty substances and the fatty membranes within the body, but it helps to protect that myelin from premature deterioration. And then we have alpha lipoic acid. There have been a lot of really great studies on alpha lipoic acid. Actually, as a matter of fact, one here a few years ago found, it was an animal study, but it found that alpha lipoic acid helped restore the blood-brain barrier in animals with vascular inflammation where they had blood-brain barrier damage. So alpha lipoic acid is a B vitamin-like compound. Technically, it's not a B vitamin, but it's close in relation to the B vitamins, and that and it can be very, very beneficial as an antioxidant, but also to protect the blood-brain barrier. And then copper as well. Copper is very crucial because copper, like B12, copper helps B12 produce the myelin, right, around your nerves. And so a copper deficiency can actually cause neuropathy. You can get demyelinating disease as a result of copper deficiency. So again, I could go on and on, folks, about nutrient associations to the nervous system, but I wanted to just drive home the point. I wanted you to understand the concept so that you could take action on it. And so what's the action really that you should take? Like, based on all these things that we're saying, what can you do, right? What can you do? If you walk away from this show tonight with any kind of action steps, let's talk about what those need to look like. Number one, if you've got a neurological disease, get the proper HLA-DQ testing to identify whether or not gluten's an issue for you. And don't you remember what I said? Don't just have them run celiac genes. We want to run the whole gambit of genetic allele testing. Number two, obviously, if you're gluten sensitive, if your testing comes back positive, eliminate gluten. Number three, measure inflammation. Ask your doctor to check you for inflammation, because remember, one of the things that causes leaky brain and sets the stage for all this is inflammation. Now, part of it may be gluten-induced inflammation, so that's a possibility, but one of the things that you can do is, if you're trying to be objective, is to measure whether or not you have the inflammation in the first place, so that you can monitor it as you change your diet, right? So there's a test called C-reactive protein, and specifically HSCRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's a great test. There's another one called erythrocyte sedimentation rate, another good test to help measure systemic inflammation levels. Ferritin can also be used to measure as an inflammatory marker. So these are good ones, along with homocysteine, which I talked about earlier. So ask your doctor to measure these compounds, because if they're elevated, you want to monitor it as you're changing your diet. You want to monitor it and make sure these things are coming down, because if they're not coming down, there may be something else for you that's leading to chronic inflammation that's damaging your nerve tissue. And so you don't want to be remiss. You don't want to leave anything out. But again, if we're going down the pathway of looking at gluten as the potential first trigger, the fourth thing that I would encourage you to do is have your nutrient levels checked. Nutrient levels are critical because, again, if you've got years of gluten exposure, you're malnourished, years of inflammation, you're malnourished. Figure out what it is for you. I've seen cases where, I was almost sure somebody was B12 deficient. When I ran their testing, they weren't, but they may have had a copper deficiency or a different nutrient deficiency that was also impacting their nervous system. So don't guess at this. Remember, the longer you wait, the worse the condition gets, the longer it's going to take for you to heal. So you really want to get your doctor involved in this as early in the interim as possible. Don't wait on this. And then number five action step I'll encourage you to take is to look at other foods, because it's not always gluten. There's other foods that sometimes can be the triggers for the reaction. And for some people, gluten causes food sensitivities and food allergies to develop because of the leaky gut. So you can develop reactions to other foods as a result of gluten exposure. So checking for other foods can become very important. That way because remember, what's changeable? What can we be empowered to do? We can change our diet. That's super, super easy to do, especially if you're struggling and your quality of life is poor because of neurological disease. And so diet change is one of the simplest things in the world, but don't guess. Right? Get granular, get detail-oriented information so that you can dive in and take some serious action. So those are just, again, some walkaways. You can walk away from the show today with an understanding that these things can all be measured, these things can all be checked. If you're struggling, they should be being checked, and you can take some serious action toward moving away from neurological disease. All right, let's open it up. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.